God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life.
1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 to 35, if you're following along at home. Women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. If there is something they want to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Thoughts?
Context. Worship services have denigrated into shouting matches, into total chaos. Why? Women are abusing the new freedom that they have, and Paul says stop it. Also, women are trying to teach and they've not gotten an education, which is tragic because they weren't allowed to go to school. But women who have an education are to teach. That's why Priscilla taught the great preacher, Apollos. So it's fascinating that Paul also writes right there in 1 Corinthians, when women pray and prophesy, they're to have their heads covered. Well, what's the matter with you, Paul? Are you schizophrenic? Don't you remember what you just said? Are you contradicting yourself? No, he's not. He's addressing two different situations, I believe, there. Chaos in worship. And as a pastor, I have to be careful that our worship services don't deteriorate into chaos, because we have some very emotionally charged people who can just rip the shreds out of a worship service with chaos and disorder. And so, no, you're not going to speak at this time because of order. But then women were allowed to pray and prophesy.
But before raising objections, I don't know, Stuart, if you agree with that analysis, if you have anything to add.
No, that's where my mind goes. Not directly related to this passage, but we have, at minimum one, maybe two, fascinating discourse between two ancient Roman emperors talking about a Christian disciple who's a female, and mathetes in the Greek is teacher. And so they are scoffing over this discourse of theirs that we have, this ancient manuscript, saying, can you believe that Christians actually have females teaching? And so whether that is discordant and contradictory to what's going on here, I don't think so. I would add another interpretation of women should remain silent. As you probably know, contextually speaking, even with other civilizations, if you were to remain silent in a service like that, it meant you already knew what was being taught. And those who were speaking up didn't quite know yet.
So I would agree with this if we were talking about 1 Timothy. If we're talking about 1 Timothy 2:12, I think that this interpretation works very well. It's all about context. In fact, just to read that verse, because it's actually very similar. 1 Timothy 2:12, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man. Rather, she should remain silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And it was not Adam who was deceived, and so on and so forth. So women shouldn't speak in churches, this kind of thing. Now, there's so much about that verse, which I think you can apply this kind of sort of critical scholarship to. The word for authority. I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man. It's almost like the authority and the teaching sort of go together. It's almost like by teaching, assume authority, and particularly authority that they don't have. In fact, the words that Paul uses there in the Greek, I think it's authentine, I don't know how to pronounce it, authentine, is this word for authority, which in other contexts tends to mean seizing authority that you don't have, that you shouldn't have. And in fact, Paul uses a different word to say authority elsewhere. So there's something very particular going on here. Women shouldn't speak or assume authority over men, rather they should remain silent. That is, women shouldn't take authority that they don't have and speak with that kind of thing, right? So something a bit like what you're saying there. And also there's this idea that there were sort of these cults of feminine divinity that were cropping up, like the cult of Artemis, which had, these women preachers. And it may be that, Paul is writing to Ephesus here. He's writing to a specific church, and he's saying, okay, these women are taking authority that they don't have to speak with knowledge that they don't have, that they think they have, and they shouldn't do that. They should be quiet, right? Fine. That's Timothy. The problem with the quote from 1 Corinthians is that women should be silent in churches. Firstly, we don't have the same thing with the authority and whatnot. It just says women should be silent in churches. They're not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. It's now a reference to their subordination under law, which doesn't arise in Timothy. Also, if there is something they want to learn, let them ask their husbands at home. If this was just a case of these incredibly knowledgeable women who were sort of speaking too much, or maybe they had to remain silent because they already knew what they were talking about, why would Paul say if they have a question, they should go and ask their husbands at home. Like, it seems like a much more troublesome verse, for it is shameful for women to speak in church. Like, my solution to this, I don't think Paul wrote these words. Especially given that, like you say, just a moment ago, Paul has said that women should cover their hair when they prophesy. Firstly, it's not necessarily the case. I suppose you could prophesy outside of church, right? Like, it's not necessarily a contradiction. You could say, like, somebody's prophesying out on the street, and if you're going to do that, cover your hair. Right? That it doesn't say. I don't think Paul would be contradicting himself just to say that women shouldn't speak in church. Because when he says that women should cover their hair, it's specifically when they prophesy. It's not when they speak in church. It's when they prophesy, right? But it does seem like maybe he's being a bit contradictory here. Also, he's referencing the law. They should be in submission as the law also says, which is a very, like, un-Pauline thing to do. Paul is all about, like, Christ and grace, and the law is something, and yet here this appeal is being made to the law. So he seems to contradict himself, and he also seems to make a very un-Pauline, assertion. But also, this is the only verse in any of Paul's letters which, in our earliest manuscripts, moves around in the manuscript. Sometimes it's up here, sometimes it's down here in the earliest manuscripts. And so it's this weird thing where, and also if you read the text, Paul is talking about, like, Paul is speaking to the Corinthians about Corinthian matters, and he's talking about other stuff. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, is this verse. Women should be silent in the churches. If they've got anything to ask, they should go and ask it at home. And then it's right back to talking about to the Corinthians on a completely different subject matter. So it seems to me that Paul didn't write these words. These words found their way into Paul's letter, even though he never actually wrote them. And there's some interesting scholarship to suggest that that might be the case. What seems to have possibly happened here is that a scribe who's copying out Paul's letter sees him talking about, like, women prophesying and all of this kind of stuff. And so he writes in the margin his own note, like, but women should remain silent. It's a disgrace, they should go home and ask their husbands. And as these manuscripts get copied, it finds its way into the text, which is not an uncommon thing in the ancient world for that kind of thing to happen, for something to find its way into the text like that. That would also explain why it moves around. It would also explain why it contradicts something he said a moment ago. It would also explain why it's not very Pauline. And the funny thing is, he's probably saying that because he's read it in Timothy, even though arguably Paul didn't write the entire letter of Timothy, right? And so, in other words, my solution to this, my salvation of Paul here is just to say, well, he didn't write those words. And interestingly, that allows me to absolve Paul. I'm going to say, no, Paul is this radical feminist. He gives women more rights than anyone else in the world, but at the cost of undermining our belief in the scriptural legitimacy. I mean, given the fact that this verse moves around, and it's the only one that does so, given the fact that it seems to contradict what he's just said, given the fact that it's a very un-Pauline assertion, don't you think there's some reason to think that maybe Paul actually didn't write these words?
It's a very difficult question you're raising, and I appreciate it. But I like what Mark Twain said. Mark Twain said, it's not the parts of the Bible I don't understand that disturb me. It's the parts of the Bible that I do understand that disturb me. And to be honest with you, I have a harder time with 1 Timothy 2 that you said did not present as big a problem to you. But when you read that kind of literature, you begin to understand some things are going on here that I'm not sure I understand. For instance, at the end of 1 Timothy 2, he says, women will be saved through childbearing.
Yeah, right.
Oh my goodness, what are you telling me, Paul? That women are going to be saved by having babies? No. But obviously Gnosticism taught the physical child bringing children into the world is dirty and inferior. And I think the Bible clearly teaches, no, the body is a beautiful gift from God. So don't trivialize childbearing and think it's wrong. Also, when he says Adam was formed first,
yes,
who gives a rip? Unless you're dealing with pantheism, which says Mother Earth, that's what's really significant. And if you're battling in Ephesus, pantheism that says we worship planet Earth, we worship nature, and you're saying, oh, no, we don't worship nature, we worship the God who created nature. That's very similar to the first commandment. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of slavery, out of the land of Egypt. You're to have no other gods before me. Well, why is he so fascinated about no other gods before me? Because of polytheism. And I think Moses is pointing out to the Jewish people, we are not polytheists. We don't believe in many gods dancing on the clouds. We believe in one creator of heaven and earth. So I think understanding the culture that is being addressed by these authors is very important, be it Paul in 1 Corinthians, Paul in 1 Timothy 2, or a lot of the Old Testament.
Or indeed